You are listening to the Fascia Guide, a podcast about the living body, about new research and a new perspective on health, pain and what it means to be alive. The Fascia Guide is a conversation between Hans Bolin, innovator and fascia expert, Per Johansson, Doctor of Human Ecology and historian of science and ideas, and me, Axel Bolin. We have been talking about why we are so fascinated about fascia as a subject, and we have been talking about what fascia is, what fascia does, but also how we as a Western society or as a Western culture has problem with understanding the living body and concepts like flow and pressure and how something works as a living whole. But in this episode, I would like to switch focus a little bit and talk about what it is to talk about fascia. Because we have been talking about fascia since 2013 in various formats to various people, and there is something that happens with people when they hear about it. Like some people are really skeptical, and some people are extremely fascinated and open-minded, and some people are really intrigued about what this new research actually could mean. And when they realize that it's real, it could change their whole way of looking at the body. So why is it interesting to talk about fascia, and what happens to people when we do that?
My main experience of meeting people, different kind of people, is they don't have so much knowledge about how their minds work, or how their body works, or what kind of nutritions, minerals and vitamins they need for feeling well or being perfect. And that's actually, if I meet a top athlete, it's the same. If I meet a guy who is performing well, a CEO for a company, it's the same. If I meet a specialist in the traditional mainstream medical area, it's the same. Because fascia is another perspective that if I meet a common man or a common woman, they usually are intrigued and interesting about the perspective, and they usually light up. It's like fascia is a light within the body. It's a way of looking at the body that's relieving, give hope, and also
Empowering.
Yeah, empower, because am I that interesting in a anatomic field? Yes, you are. And usually I also say that the thing with fascia as a perspective is it's quite easy to understand, and it's quite hard to grasp. Because if you take the main if you take it's around every cell, it's around every organ, it's the communication grid physically for the whole body. It's the way of the body to feel connected with all the cells, all the minerals, all the vitamins, everything at the same time. Then it's electrifying, because it's a way of looking at the body in so many perspectives. That the body is energy, that the fascia is communication in the speed of light and the speed of sound, and it's complicated. It's all over the place at the same time,
and also that it's really unique, because that's the thing I'm thinking about when you're saying this. If you look at the body, like we've learned to look at the body, like we open anatomy books and look at that, or we ask the doctor and they'll talk about that. They're always talking about the collective body of the bodies that they have studied. But if you look at fascia, you need to take into account the unique person and that unique person's effect on their own body, which makes it brings the attention back to the person you're talking to, right?
Yeah. And it's also a way of it's a way of understanding the uniqueness of yourself, but also how in principles it's the same for every living human being. And that we also, fascia can also explain with the magnetic field that you have from the heart, that we can sense things that are outside us. and it also can explain why the outside really are in the inside at the same time. So it's many perspectives, and I think it's like one of the researcher we have studied a lot with, that one who was filmed Living Fascia, Jean-Claude Gimco. He said that it's a paradigm shift. It's another way of looking at it. I think it's the interesting. It's maybe as big as to see that the universe is without ending. That's a hard thing to understand. That it's without ending and without beginning, and that it's always changing. And a metaphor for the body of the fascia is that we have an own universe that's our own body, and it's in perspective quite I said it to one researcher who was in stars and galaxies, that some galaxy really, when the galaxy starts, it looks like fascia. So it's amazing what kind of things you can see in the body, and why it's interesting to talk about fascia to all kinds of people, because it will enlighten them. It will be, they can see different things with themselves.
My experience is very similar to Hans, actually, even though I talk about it from another point of interest, since I'm not a fascia practitioner in any way. It's more of a combination of personal and philosophical, scientific interest. But what I have noticed is that if I talk to people who are in some way intellectually or professionally invested in a certain perspective, perhaps generally, but more particularly in relation to the body, they are as a rule skeptical. But if I, with some rather rare exceptions, I would say, but if I talk to people who are not invested in that way, they could be very intellectual, but they could also be quite ordinary people in ordinary professions. And as a rule, some of them are skeptical as well, but most become thoroughly fascinated and want to know more. So I've thought about this, and I think that I think you're right the way you stated it when we started talking now, Axel, that since it is, or at least you implied it, since we're talking, if one wants to start to understand fascia, not only how it works, but what it means, the consequences of starting to understand fascia, both intellectually and in relation to your own living body, in relation to yourself, then it really is a very different perspective. And so if you are intellectually or professionally in some way invested in another perspective, like the dominant paradigm of medical professions, especially, then you, what is it you hear when someone starts to talk about fascia from that perspective and says that it requires you to understand this and that, and it's a seamless system, it works in real time in this and that way, and it doesn't really, you could say that fascia doesn't really care about the categorization we are used to making, and differentiation and different organs and so on. This is a kind of direct provocation to many people, because they notice, even if they perhaps they don't think it at the moment, but they notice that this is a very deep challenge to their whole worldview, actually. So it's a kind of
I think
there's a lot of psychology in this. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think you can have I'm 62 years old, and compare you're also over 60, and I think you can have a parallel to when the World Wide Web came. Some of the big companies because I worked with IBM then, and I also was following Microsoft. It was not that big then, but IBM wasn't interested in the internet, not Microsoft either. IBM had mainframe the computers, and personal computers. They thought it was so stupid. It was so you can't build system for personal computers. It's just for play. One of my relatives, he had a computers firm. He was building accounting systems, and he was mainly in the not mainstream, but the mini computers before the PC. But he said that mini computers was out and it was PC network, and it was in the mid 90s, because he thought that it was really collapsing the mainstream and the mini computers. But it didn't. But the thing that changed everything was the World Wide Web and the computers, the personal computers. And now we have personal computers in our phones. We have so much power in our phones, and it's changed so much. And I think that's not. It's an analog or a metaphor for why the fascia system or the fascia perspective is a revolution in looking at the human body, because it's a way of connecting everything, and we haven't had that kind of perspective in modern science. If you look at living systems in the mainstream area, but it's coming now, and therefore it's when you talk about people and they said that when you talk about frequencies and everything, because you hear with frequency, you the body react on frequencies, you feel with frequencies, you feel with pressure. And you have so many metaphors to the living body and what the body is really up to and what it's feeling and what we can learn to feel. The thing we try to develop is skills for therapists, how to actually connect with the living tissue, to connect to the fascia system, and to see what kind of information intellectually can you get from a living system. And that's also what Neil Teese said, the researcher who was one of the first who discovered the interstitium, and it's all over the body. He said that if we have fascia as a system or a way of looking, then we can connect Western medicine and Eastern medicine, because it's another perspective of looking at the body. So I think it's the hard thing is to see what kind of simplification or metaphors can be used to overcome the to see the body as a whole, because that's the problem. That's the real problem. And I don't know if the metaphor of World Wide Web and computer science or personal computers is one that you can relate to, but it's a paradigm shift, and you have to look at real different perspectives.
I actually think that's a close analogy between what you're hinting at in relation to the World Wide Web and understanding the meaning and consequences of that, and the meaning and consequences of starting to understand fascia. I think there's a real analogy. I was quite early on involved in web-related quite early on engaged in grasping the meaning of the World Wide Web and talking about it and consulting about it to many people. And I made a very similar experience in that regard as I just said in regard to fascia, that some people seem to intuitively grasp it, and some people were quite unable to even start to think about it adequately. And I think that one common factor is that if you're used to thinking in terms of what you might call linear causality, that there's this kind of intellectually clear causal connection between one thing and the other thing and the third thing and the fourth thing, which I think we are very indoctrinated into thinking in that way. And this is also a way of thinking. You can see that in relation to the body. Okay, there's a heart failure. Then it can't have anything to do with your legs, perhaps, or your muscles. So very, very simple linear kind of thinking. If you try to apply that in relation to understanding fascia, you won't even start to understand it. And it's exactly the same with the World Wide Web and its consequences in society and culture.
But I think what's interesting with this subject, this topic, is I don't think it's about finding the metaphor explaining it. I think it's interesting because there could be so many metaphors explaining it. And why I'm saying that is because fascia is an interesting lens where you can see everything from. So you take any subject and you put it to a fascia perspective, a fascia lens, and it comes out on the other side being something you can understand as a whole. So it's a subject where you can bring all other subjects in and then look at them to a different perspective, because it's a perspective of the living and a perspective of wholeness, and then you can see everything from a different point of view. And a proof of that is, so up until this day when we're sitting here, we have recorded 133 podcast episodes about fascia in Swedish. And in the beginning we started like this. We talked about fascia as a subject and how people are reacting to it and the research and all about that. But after a while we start to look at many different subjects on the body or on people, and we have talked about everything from the microbiome and gut flora to thoughts and feelings to fear to anxiety to cultural and societal changes to elite athlete performance to sex hormones to the immune system to the lymphatic system. We have talked about so many different kinds of subject, but also one episode is like about the importance of communication in terms of healing from trauma. So it's so many different kind of subjects fits in the fascia lens. You can put everything, and in this sense, the fascia is just a representation of what the living body actually is. It's a way to understand the body, and then what happens is that you take the subject, and it can be everything, anything, and then you put it through a fascia lens. But then you also need to put it through the personal lens of the one body, like we said in the beginning with Hans' example of different people and how they react, because it's my living body, and it's my thoughts affecting that body. It's my behavior, my food, the environment I'm in, the things I do. All these things are affecting my body, and it can be explained or understood through the fascia metaphor, the fascia lens. And that's when it becomes interesting, and that's when people get interested. And what I have experienced throughout all these years is that the important thing is to give someone that first push, like ignite that first spark and enlighten that the curiosity, because as soon as someone gets curious, then they start reading on their own, listening on their own, watching things on their own, talking with other people, and then it's kind of addictive in a sense to learn about the fantastic living body. And once you start, it's hard to stop.
It's one of the most important things in relation to understanding and seeing the value of thinking in fascia terms, so to speak, is exactly what you said, in my experience too, both my personal experience and my experience in talking with others, that you can't, to really begin to become curious, as you said, about it, you have to have that aha moment which says to you that what I actually experience as various sensations in my own body is directly relevant also to my conceptual or intellectual understanding of what is going on. So it's fascia make more than most fields of interest and study makes it necessary to connect theory and practice in yourself and in relation to others. Because if you don't take that step, if you don't start to thinking that way, you won't really understand the implications. Because this is also what makes it possible, as I see it, to talk about all the various subjects you listed earlier in terms of from a fascia perspective.
And I think there's two really interesting things that comes with getting interested in fascia. And one thing is the thing we touched upon, that's the empowering thing. It's empowering because I can learn to understand how my body works. And it's my body it's about. It's not your body or everyone else's, but it's me understanding my body and basically who I am. But on the one side, it's empowering. On the other side, it's also humbling. Because I realized that I need to take a step back and look at things from a different way. I need to think differently. I need to question things I've learned. I need to reevaluate and start feeling. I need to go to other sources. I need to learn different stuff. I need to realize that I have to learn new things to understand this. And if you look at the world, I would say that more people being empowered and humble, that's actually really interesting. What would happen if more people are both empowered and humbled?
That's very
and
useful.
So if we move on from the why we should spread this, why is it important to spread fascia knowledge? All of the things we've said now for the last 20 minutes, but also that it's empowering and humbling. The next question is, how do you do it? And for those of you who don't know, Hans, you have been talking about fascia to almost everyone you've been meeting for the last 10, 15 years.
15 years.
And that's interesting because that's one way to do it. If you are verbal in that sense, if you are daring in that sense, just talk to people about it. But for some people, it's not that easy just to bring that subject up in a sense. But we actually developed something this fall. It just dawned upon us that, hey, this is what we should do. And it's based on that. So we've been working a lot with therapists who treat different kind of customers, and they do the treatment, but then they notice that people who are interested in fascia, people who have listened to the podcast or read articles or started to learn more about fascia, are actually easier to treat. Like they respond better to the treatment because they are probably more empowered and humble at the same time. So they're easier to treat or easier to help. So then the therapists at the clinic started to give out podcast episodes as recipes between treatments. So it's like, until you come next time, you should listen to episode 29 that's about breathing. And then you can try breathing, and then you come back and see what happens. So that's something that started to happen. And about 2-3 months ago, we decided to systemize this and see, okay, what if this is something that people do and it actually works, why not do it more? So then we developed something we call the Fascia Guide method, and this is actually something you can subscribe to right now. So if you go into the fasciaguide.com, you can go to the Fascia Guide method, you can subscribe to it. And what happens is, or how it works is, you think about someone that you want to help, and then you think about what do they need to understand or realize or listen to or think about, or what could inspire them. And then you send them something from the Fascia Guide, or something, it could be anything. You send them with the purpose of them getting that extra insight that will take them to the next level of understanding. And then you just send it to them. Not like, hey, you should definitely listen to this, but like, I listened to this and I thought of you, and it will be interesting to hear what you say about this. And then you send that. And by doing that, you strengthen your relationship, you show that you care, and you can start that conversation, or you can take that next step in understanding things. So that's something we have been using, and the more people do this, the more fascia spreads, and it's really interesting to see what happens. And Hans, you can say that people who have been listening a lot to the podcast is easier to deal with.
Oh, to treat.
Yeah. Because
they have been listening to, as I started, and it's also my own experience. Most people doesn't get an recipe or a manual how to treat or how to do with the body or their mind, because that's one thing we have to experience, be alive, and to understand what am I. And if from a fascia perspective, it's another way of it's another way of looking at it, and it's another way of understanding the whole body and what's reflecting into it. So I think it's I usually, when we also learn the one who we train to be a fascia specialist, to tell stories. When you meet a guy or a woman that's going to treat, maybe tell a story about a similar case that they can relate to, because it can be really hard to get facts thrown in your.
Yeah, it's hard if I tell you, Hans, this is what you should do. I see your problems and this is your solution. That can always be, it doesn't always go very well. People don't kind of handle criticism in that sense.
If you can tell metaphor or parallels is histories to the same problem, it can help them to understand what kind of state they are in.
Because the real change actually happens when I realize that I need to do something, not when somebody tells me that I should do something. And I can realize that by hearing about someone else going through something, and then I'm like, hey, that's what I'm going through. Interesting. And then
and I also think that you can be really philosophic and interesting and talk about fascia. I'm sure if I told this last time, but James Oshman has a metaphor about, tells about what the water is, because everything in the body is water, and it's everywhere. It's everywhere in the body at the same time. And water is also a semiconductor, and it can be charged in both ways, both negative and positive. So it's an interesting substance. And he was on a water conference, and he said that it's an interesting way of looking at the body. If you see, it's a movie you can look at YouTube called Hacking Reality, and just the first 2 minutes, it's a woman who's standing in a pool, and she say, "Where am I?" And it's a voice, "Where you always been? Where am I going? Where you always been?" So if we are made from water, and we are always in water, and so where are we going? To water. So you can also discuss different things in a fascia perspective from that kind. It's an interesting metaphor, that because we always said at funerals of from dust to dust, you come from dust and you go into dust or earth. What do you say? Earth or?
I don't know the English translation to that one, but yeah, but you come from the earth and you should go back to the earth. Basically.
But you come from water, and you're going back to water. And
no human being is a plant.
No, we are always in water, and all plants are also water. So it's just language and metaphors that you can really unlock the way of looking at yourself. And we were in a spa in December, and I was in a sauna, and I was meeting with two guys. One was had tattoos on him, and the other one was not. He had no tattoos on his. And I said, "What are you doing?" "We have a business conference." "Okay, and who are you?" "This is my pastor. He's one of the," said he was in the tattoo guy, "and I'm an ex-criminal, and now work with the church in Uppsala." And I say, "Oh, how interesting. So you're talking about the Holy Spirit then?" Yes. "So you're talking about fascia?" No, yeah. So, are we? Yes, because if you can talk about, because what kind of frequency do we have, or what kind of thing will you talk about if you talk about the Holy Spirit and the spirit in the body? You talk about the fascia,
the flow and the
flow and the
energy
fascia, and they were like looking at me. It's like, but it's you can talk different kind of subject when you talk about the interstitium and the gel structure of the body.
And that's the key learning here, is that all people react to information differently, and a different type of information differently. Some people need a conversation, some people need to watch something, some people need to read something, some people need to go to an expert, some people need to find out for themselves, and some people will have you can give them the information and the answer and the metaphors, but it doesn't go in, and then they need to be shaken or scared or punched, basically, to react to something. So it's completely, we have noticed that, at least, that people are completely different in their reactions to things, and it could also vary from month to month, from person to person, depending on which state they're in. So if you want to reach people and really help people, you need to develop your skills in communication, and that's something we've been working a lot with. Like, how do we explain the same thing in so many different ways so that we can reach people and start to light that spark? Because it's all about that, lighting that spark, and make them think in a different way, make them feel in a different way, and react in a different way. And it could also be that you light that spark and they start to get excited, but then life comes in the way. And then a couple of months goes by, and then they're back to where they were. So it's the consistency here is really important if you want to help people change their behavior, help people change their health. And then we go back to, why should you? Well, because it would be a much more interesting world if people are empowered, if people are humbled, if people think about the body in a different way. That could really mean fundamental changes to how the world is. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the things that you could share and how you share it, because we have so if you subscribe to the Fascia Guide method, you will get these by email, and the first thing we will help you to share is the podcast. So who can you share the podcast with? Well, anyone who's interested in the subject, or anyone interested in the body. And then you can say, I just listened to this really interesting podcast, and this episode is about this, and I really think you would enjoy it. It would be interesting to see what you think about it. And if you don't like it after 30 minutes, just turn it off and we don't have to talk about it anymore. But this is something you can share. And then if someone starts listening to the podcast, you can look at different episodes. You should really look into this thing with the flow, because you're afraid of letting go or doing this and this and that. Then you can listen to episode 7 about flow. And then we have the fascia documentary. That's also a really good introduction to fascia. And you were with us as well, Per, when we made the documentary. What was the sole purpose of the documentary?
No, I don't know if there was a sole purpose, but it was a general overview of fascia and fascia research, and interviews with scientists studying fascia, and also interviews with people who had received treatment and gotten an aha moment from that, and so it's very, very diverse content, and I think it was if there was one general purpose behind the film, it was to give to open several doors which all led to the same place, namely the realization that it really is a shift in perspective we are talking about, and I think one difficulty or challenge in communicating the meaning of fascia and why it's so interesting and valuable to start to grasp it is that we are not really used to, in our Western culture, to think we often talk about various perspectives, but I don't think we are very good at really shifting perspective as individually. To really do it, because what does it mean to shift perspective? It means that you see quite other things than you see from another perspective. If you're entrenched in one perspective, this or if I put it like this, what is a perspective? A perspective is the means by which you experience your reality. So the perspective is really what tells you what is possible, what you can see, what you can experience. So if you really shift perspective, not just as a game of thought, but really shift perspective, then you will literally be able to experience quite other things than you were before. So this is what it is about. And judging from certain reactions to the movie, some people seem to have had that aha moment just from watching the movie, actually.
Yeah,
So
I
they
remember.
were able to sort of receive the message.
I remember when we launched it, because I was actually on paternity leave, so I was home with my daughter, and I worked 1 day a week just to keep things going, and then we decided to launch the video or the movie, and we were overwhelmed with the response. So I got thousands of emails from people saying how touched they were, and there. The thing is that we have watched that documentary so many times, because we've had various events and movie showings, and then if you show up to the movie showing, you kind of have to see the documentary as well, because some people see it for the first time, some people the second time, but we were sitting there seeing it for like the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, and I'm a producer myself on the documentary, so I've seen it a couple of times before it was even published. And what strikes me is that the idea is that this is something you can show to someone who has never heard of this before. So it could be a great introduction. But the more I've seen it, I also realize that it's an overwhelming documentary, in a sense that it's like, okay, here is this new thing, and you might have never heard of it, but here's a new thing, and here you have Carla Stecker, professor of anatomy, in a long interview explaining why this is a real thing, and then you have another professor saying, hey, this is a real thing, and we can see things differently, and then you have voices from the Fascia Research Congress in 2018 saying, this is a really interesting new thing that can really open up doors, and then you have different cases showing that this is what can happen to someone who has problem with their foot, this is what happens to someone who is a professional dancer. Here's what happens to someone who is a yoga instructor. So it's like so many different cases and what can happen if you take this seriously. And then that opens the door to different possibilities. So it's both an introduction and, as you say, also a way to open up the perspective and give hope to this could really be something. So if you want someone to understand why you are so fascinated with fascia, the documentary is a really good way to do it. But it is 53 minutes long, I think, in the latest version. And Hans, you asked me for a shorter version before. You said, can we do a 5-minute version?
But we have a 5-minute version.
So we have a 5-minute version. So that's also
the problem. The problem is we had a thing that we're going to as a business opportunity, a business thing that we wanted to do treatment and diagnose and treatment of pain, and especially whiplash. And there, in that case, it's interesting to have a short summary of the movie, and we have that. It's 5 minutes long, because my experience that it's quite many people has listened hundreds of minutes on the fascia pod in Sweden, but usually if you have specialists like in insurance companies or investors, you have a shorter attention span. So you have like 3 minutes or 2 minutes, and you have actually to show things in another perspective. And I think also the thing we have been talking about is to show the anatomy of a living body as a animation, that you can see what actually has happened in the living body. at the same time, and that maybe can be a groundbreaker for making more people interesting in what they're actually saying, because every researcher we have talked to today come from specialty fields, and nobody is actually looking at the whole body at the same time, and that's a really interesting perspective, as we can see with the Hubble telescope, when we could see the whole of the universe from another perspective. It was amazing what they actually could see, and they couldn't see it before. So I think one thing about humans that's quite interesting. We have to see things, and the things we see is also small perspective of what reality is. So it's like crazy. Why do we have to see from that perspective? But when we have the light that we see is so small.
But that 5-minute version has been used by now. Around 100 people have used it just to spread it to people who are not that interested, but kind of interested, because it's a very hands down 5-minute cut, and it's basically only quotes from famous researchers in the fascia field.
Yeah.
And it's you can't question that fascia is real when you listen to these people in this. So I remember you told me about a skeptical doctor.
Yeah.
And you showed it to him, and he was like, "Oh, this is actually interesting." So he went from being like, "What is this nonsense?" to saying, "Oh, this is really interesting," in 5 minutes. And that's the power of the visual communication in that sense. So, and the other thing that we have done that you can, and we have done this to help you spread this, that's the purpose of it. We have recorded 15 to 45 second videos explaining why this is an interesting article, why this is an interesting podcast episode, or why this is an interesting documentary, and we put it in the top of all the articles on the fasciaguide.com. So this is a really easy way for you to share this if you want to help spread the fascia as a message, if you want to help empower people and help with this humbling thing and help keep people get interested in their body. The Fascia Guide method is a really good way for you to spread the fascia knowledge. And there are articles about frozen shoulder or about water, and Gerard Pollack's research is about, we have articles on strolling under the skin and the living tissue, and how you understand the immune system and how you handle oxidative stress. And we have about sex hormones and how they affect fascia in females, and we have about fascia as a flow and about different vitamins and minerals and supplements. So it's a lot of information on the Fascia Guide. And either you go in there and you share it, or you can subscribe to the Fascia Method and share it in that sense, so you get this information. So with that put aside, like this is how you can spread it. The final question for this episode is, what do you think would happen if more people get interested in this? What would happen if more people start getting interested in fascia?
I think it could be almost like a revolution in the look at the empower people and why life is so important and why every human is important, because the uniqueness of the living body is really amazing. And I think one thing I saw now was they saw that the hidden thing that really is that thinking can be matter. That the thing we actually think actually can be matter. So from a scientific way, we are really interesting as species as a whole, and we are all. I think you can empower people that really empower people that can make another perspective, another way of looking at the living planet that we are in, and looking at the connection we have to the living things and what we can do with them, and because everything is interconnected, in a fascia perspective, you have to have nutritions, you have to have minerals, you have to have vitamins, you have to be aware of your thoughts, you have to be aware of your thoughts of others, because it will relate to you, and we have it like in when you have the genome therapy and you have the thing about how about our minds really can affect our genes. So it's a totally different perspective, and it's a lot of interesting things that we can have in the healthcare systems about looking at different issues, but really empower people.
Well, at the moment, I have nothing to add to what Hans said. It was quite an exhaustive list of
things you can do in a fascia perspective.
So I right now I will just agree with what Hans said. It's really eye-opening and empowering, and it makes you realize that you are actually alive. And you are actually alive in relation to everything that occurs within you and around you.
Yeah. And also from that we started with from just one thing about everything. Almost every disease is inflammation, and inflammation is in the fascia, and the inflammation cells are in the fascia, and it's lack of flow, or it's something that's not okay, and you can actually treat it. So you can treat almost everything you can treat with a fascia perspective, if it would be common. So it's a totally, as Gimbe taught, it's a revolution. It's a paradigm shift, and you can have lots of different way of looking at things from a fascia perspective.